In the last section, we covered how certain characteristics, such as brightness or contrast, can either draw the viewer's eye to the main subject or away from it. In this section, I'll explain the impact of other elements that make up our scene. Elements such as line or textures. Now, there are many types of lines that can be used in our photography, so we're going to cover the ones that you'll encounter most. And the most common ones are, of course, the horizontal line, and the vertical line, and the diagonal line. Each one of these has separate properties, and let's look at how they influence the way we perceive images made up of them. The horizontal line tends to give the feeling of rest. It doesn't lend a lot of action to the image. Not a lot of activity going on. Photographs that are made up of predominantly horizontal lines generally feel calm and sedentary. Vertical lines in an image tend to impart a feeling of permanence. Solid, unwavering, or sturdiness are words that come to mind. Final or unyielding. Diagonal lines, by contrast, add a lot of implied motion to the scene. It is almost as if they exude movement, as in this shot of the waterfall. You can feel the motion from the upper right to the lower left. And the lines can often impart tension as well, as in these diagonal trees. Now, we've got a couple vertical trees here, but it's the diagonal ones that really take over. They're the ones that we notice the most. In this shot, I used the pencil and the pencil sharpener to draw your eye straight to the writing, the Missoula Artist Shop. If those lines weren't there, you would still go to the writing, but these lines just take you there a little bit quicker. The lines of the vertical lines of the piano keys here are, again, pretty stable. We're looking at this piano straight on. We're ready to sit down and play. And perhaps it might be a slow tune. Put them at a diagonal, and suddenly that implied motion makes your hands feel like they can just run up the keys. Here we've got some columns, some vertical lines, and a few horizontal lines going across the top. There's nothing about this image that shows energy or movement. Very straight on, almost you could say boring. The diagonal lines mixed with the vertical lines in this image add a little life, a little energy. In this shot of the open ocean, we've got predominantly horizontal lines going across. There is a little bit of motion or energy in this shot, but not as much as compared to, say, this one, where the diagonal lines are more prominent. Similar thing here. Horizontal line going across the top, very restful. Add some diagonal lines at the bottom, and now there's a little more excitement in the image. Again, not good or bad, just what do you want to portray? I'm actually very fond of this shot for its calmness, but this one does have more energy. Converging lines. Converging lines are a way to walk through the photograph in a very quick manner. So when you see converging lines, you start at the bottom and you go right up to where the lines end. Same thing here. Your eye follows the lines and brings you ultimately to this point in the photograph. And that's kind of the idea behind the photograph. The secondary subjects are these mountains in the back, and they let you know where we're at. But truly, this image is all about these lines heading back. This is also helped because of these this high area of contrast with these vertical posts. Converging lines again. In this image, you do go to the traps in the center, and you get there very quickly because all these lines draw you back there. If you tend to wander out away from the bright barrels and baskets here, you eventually find your way back to the lines and they dart you back again. So all eyes to the center. The converging lines of the chairs and table here, they tend to bring you right back to the bar. Now, because this is brighter, you tend to stay in here long, a little bit longer than you would, say, out here in the darker areas of the frame. But still, when you get back here, you run along these lines. Now, these two lines are heightened by this line coming in as well, because it mimics this bottom line. So all four of these lines all point right down here to the center of the bar. Now, if it was a little bit lighter back here, or I had a person in a brilliant red, then you would stay back here much longer. As it is, you tend to wander out, come back in, and do the loop again. In this set of converging lines, the energy is expanded upon because we're looking at very dark subjects, and the lines themselves are white. So we have dark vertical subjects, and we have very bright diagonal subjects. A lot of energy in this frame. There's a lot of eye movement. The S-curve, it's a more meandering curve. It's not so fast and to the point as, say, the converging lines. But in an S-curve, you kind of start at the bottom and slowly wander through the image until you get to the back. In this image of the water on the sandstone, it's the same sort of deal. You are moving back towards the back, but it's in a slower pace. So you kind of stop and smell the roses, as it would be, on the sides of the image. So use S-curves when you want the viewer to notice more of the surrounding parts of the image, and you can use converging lines when you want them to race past and just go right to the back immediately. Now, not all S-curves have to be real. In this case, we have some implied S-curves. This is not a particularly attractive composition, but if you can search out and find a curve within here, as I've done by going vertical and coming in a little bit tighter, you can see the S-curve, or in this case, the implied S-curve. Now let's look at this ocean shot again. Here we have an S-curve, and it's just a little bit more elegant than the diagonal line. So we have elegant, meandering through to the back, diagonal lines, lots of energy, and you can feel this is stopping you a little bit more. You tend to spend more time in this area here rather than following the S-curve back. Curves are generally, as I say, a little bit more elegant. They tend to round things out, and it's an easier way to move through a frame. And sometimes vertical and horizontal lines can actually stop your visual movement into the frame. Here, we start at the bottom and we kind of follow this line around, and we may come back and follow it again and then eventually get up into here. But notice the difference between this image and this image. Same railing, same building, but in this image we tend to get stopped at the railing. It's a little harder to get back. And so it's a little bit more jolting for the eye. This shot shows a mixture of lines. We've got some curved lines and some diagonal lines. And it's an okay mix, but it's not as strong as when all the lines work together. And here we have a series of diagonals that are almost converging up to this point in the image right here. This is more effective as far as having high impact. Look at how the diagonal line changes in this dollar bill. When it's placed near to the frame and more horizontal, we tend to look across the frame from left to right. Whereas when it's placed at more of a diagonal line going back, then of course it draws our eye to the glasses a little bit quicker. Now, where lines end, or where they draw you to, is a very important area in the photograph. So you can see here, we're following the line of the post up to the light and a line of the arc. And so the energy kind of stops right in here. Notice the difference when the light is a little bit lower. It gives us room to breathe up top here and actually highlights a little bit more of this area down here. You wouldn't think so, but in the previous image, where the light is higher, all the energy rushes up to the top here, and we're stuck right in here. By lowering the light and giving this more space in here, it frees us up to look around the image more. And we need to be careful with lines because they're so strong in a photograph, and especially so here because the lines are bright. We don't want them going out the corners as they do in this image. Here they go directly out the corner, and that has the effect of pulling your eye down and out the corner. You may start here and go back, but if you follow the line back this way, you leave the frame, and it's more difficult to get in. Where in this image, I've added just a little darkness around the corners. And that's just enough. That's all you need. So be careful with white lines coming out of your corner. Now in this curved line, the action tends to bring you into the frame and then across the frame. And that's pretty good. It's again a meandering sort of slow walk along this path. But that same line at a different angle can have a drastically different feel. This one tends to run you straight across the frame rather than in. It's coming in a little bit, but not nearly as much as this one. So this is allowing you to look around the other parts of the image more. This one is racing you across the image. Again, when we see lines in the photograph, our natural reaction is to follow the lines. So we do see the brighter spots on the mountains up here, but we're also paying attention to these lines in the bottom. And this is a decent composition in that it brings you back to this area, ultimately where the action is in the photograph. But notice how this changes when the lines are a little bit smaller. When they're pressed further at the bottom and the actual length of the line isn't as long, they don't have as much of an impact in the image. Again, backwards, longer lines, you pay more attention to them. Shorter lines, you pay less attention to them. Right or wrong? Neither. It just depends on what you want to accent in your frame. This is more about the mountains and the reflection. This is more about the wood lines coming out here. Here we've got a crack that runs right out the corner, even though it doesn't really touch the corner. And I guess in a way it does here. We've got this bright area going straight out the corner too. But this crack is a line that our eye sees and tends to follow. This is an important line, and we may come here first. This is another line, and so we're spending some time in this area. But ultimately we'll come down to here, and we just sort of follow it right on out the frame. And we want to avoid that. So instead of composing like this, what you could do is just readjust your camera position and have the line run out a different area. Now notice there's no lines running out the corner here. This line does not run out the corner, and this line does not run out the corner. Texture. Texture or pattern can be a very interesting element within a frame, but can also lead to complete boredom. Almost like staring at wallpaper for too long. A common mistake is to photograph just texture for texture's sake. I know, I've tried 1,000 times, and never comes off the way I hope. It just ends up being monotonous. The problem is that our eyes are very good at recognizing patterns. When we look at texture, we very quickly recognize the pattern and become bored. So, the trick is to give our eyes something to fasten on after we have come to grips with the texture. Consider it a resting spot for your eyes, kind of like a welcome bench in a beautiful park, giving you time to sit down, rest, and look around the area, and then you get back on your walk again. So, something to rest on. It could be an opposing texture or a pattern, or simply an object that has some relationship to the texture, such as this leaf in the flattened grass. Here I thought the texture of the grasses and the little seedlings coming up was very, very interesting. But again, I tried to take a photograph of just it, and it becomes a little bit boring. Add an opposing texture, such as the ferns in the back. Now the image has a little bit more drama. Here we have two opposing textures, and it's pretty good and it works okay, but it's almost too split in half. There needs to be another element that becomes the resting spot. In this case, because the rock and the algae in the top, they're almost the same size in the frame. And so what happens is we're not quite sure what to look at. Now the rock is a little bit bigger, so we've got a hint. So this is pretty good, but this one's even a little bit better. Just add this hint of a different shape on the side over here, and suddenly the image starts to come to life. Same thing here. We've got two opposing textures, and it works okay, but again, the scene is almost split in half. So taking this same idea, and I was photographing a lot of red rust this day, I looked around for other areas that may have 2 or 3 different textures that could work together. And in this case, we're getting diagonal lines for a lot of motion, but we're also getting some different colors, and even though it's all the same texture, it's broken up. Look at how texture or pattern works with people. In this shot, it's a very nice image of this man, but the shirt itself is drawing your attention, and you spend more time on the shirt than you should. Now, of course, you know it's a photograph of a person, so you go to their eyes and you look there eventually. But more time is spent on the shirt. Now compare that to this image, and you look at the shirt real quick, you absorb it very fast, and you spend much more time on his face. So when you're photographing portraits, it's best to have either a very subtle pattern or solid colors, and not so bright, because they tend to detract from the face itself. And in certain situations, you can get away with texture just as it is. And now, this is all the same rock, of course, but the way the texture is lined out is such that it forms its own little pattern, and the pattern is easy to recognize, so your eye doesn't become quite as bored. Contrast. This is a very important one. The amount of contrast in an image has a lot of bearing on how the photograph will be perceived. High contrast images tend to have very strong impact, like this one. The appeal is immediate. The stark lines set up by the bright white against the dark blacks are irresistible for our eyes to follow. High contrast images are often much easier to understand. The image is roughly broken down into 2 categories, dark and light. The overall shapes in the image are defined by these levels of brightness, such as this image of a moonrise. The top half is light and the bottom half is dark. Of course, there's some subtlety to it, but generally, that's how we look at the scene. So when you see high contrast, or you make your images high contrast, think high impact, immediate appeal, immediate understanding. All the subjects are being broken down into simple shapes. With lower contrast images, the feeling is quite different, not so stark. You see much more in the midtones. In this image of the waterfall, there are various shades of gray in addition to the deep blacks and the bright whites. And those midtones compel you to explore around the image in a slower fashion, not so much of a hurry to examine everything quickly. Where high contrast is about high impact and immediate appeal, lower contrast is about subtlety. Just because an image may have some pure black and pure white doesn't immediately make it a high contrast image, though. It's common to have this type of image with a nice range of midtone values, such as this shot. Here's another example of high overall contrast, meaning it does contain black and white, but it also has a pleasing range of midtones. Notice how your eye follows the line of the road into the photograph, then it takes in the bright white sky. But when you return to the rest of the image, it's easy to explore around the midtones and enjoy the subtlety of the grays. In this image of the sand dunes, our eyes are immediately attracted to the high contrast area of the light and dark sand in the bottom of the frame. In this image, however, we are left with a completely different feeling. Notice how you don't feel the urgency in this picture? It's more about the overall color rather than the lines in the sand. In this image of the ocean and clouds, I find it to be very calming. Not a lot of contrast, but nevertheless compelling. Another shot of clouds in the ocean, but this one is very different. We have high color contrast as well as bright dark contrast. Even the waves in the bottom of the frame contrast against the sand. Much more visual movement in this shot. Now, when it comes to portraits, high and low contrast is going to make a difference every bit as much as any other type of photography. So in this shot, we're really not too concerned about what's going on in the background. It's fairly dark. Even the side of her face is dark and her hair is dark. So we immediately go to the illuminated areas and we explore. So what we're really noticing here is the shape of her face, the shape of her side of her face. And because her shirt is very well illuminated, we're drawn down there as well. Now compare this high contrast image of this woman to this lower contrast image. Notice how it's softer, of course, because it's lower contrast, but it's got a softer feeling as well. You tend to explore more of the subtle details in her hair and her face and her hands and her bracelets. And even the background, it's a little out of focus, but we can get the idea of where we're at. So high-low contrast in portraits is going to dramatically change the way the viewer perceives the person in the image. In this shot, this is mainly about the waterfall and the mountains, but the trees themselves are very dark. So we have a line of contrast in between the clouds and the trees. And that's okay, we're getting a nice sense of place here, but if you're truly thinking about the texture in the mountains and the waterfall, you could zoom in past those trees, and now you're only focused on this, and this is a much lower contrast image. Not that this is better or worse, it's just got a different feeling. Here, we may not have the same sense of place that we did in the last image, but a little bit lower contrast lets us explore more and shows us more of the detail in the crags and the rocks. In this fence at sunrise, it's a fairly high contrast scene. There's three primary elements. You have your fence, the tree, and the white cloud. And in each one of those, notice there's contrast around it. So the white against the blue of the sky, the darker tree against the lighter blue of the sky, and then the light fence against the darker surrounding area. So you're very much honed in on these three objects and spending time looking at them very rapidly from one to the next. Take that same scene under a different lighting situation, and you're not so concerned about those three elements. It becomes more of a photograph of itself. The whole image becomes a place to explore around and look at, rather than just sticking with two or three objects within the frame. Movement. When we talked about lines, we talked quite a bit about visual movement, how lines could create the sense of motion or energy in a photograph. Well, the same applies to real motion or subject motion within the frame. And shutter speed can be a powerful tool when it comes to creating strong compositions and creating this motion or stopping this motion. This kayaker was photographed with a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second, fast enough to stop the movement of the waves and the boat. The only problem is there doesn't seem to be any action at all. And that's mainly because it was just the shutter was fired at a bad time. The paddle seems to be stopped, the water seems to be stopped, and there doesn't seem to be any movement within the frame. But in this shot, there's actually something happening. Again, a fast shutter speed freezes the motion, in this case 1/500th of a second. But this time there actually is some action to freeze. The frozen water droplets show a kind of implied motion. So even though everything is tack sharp and still, we get the idea that things are moving, simply because the action has been stopped at a good moment in time. This image was captured at 1/8 of a second. That's 6 stops slower than 1/500th. Now the waves in the kayak are showing the motion as blurred rather than stopped. Which one do you prefer? I'm a fan of blurring motion myself, but that's just a personal preference. No right or wrong, just different overall feeling. In this shot of the Ferris wheel, I waited until it stopped so that I can keep the chair sharp. Then, when it began moving again, I shot it at 1/8 of a second. And then again at 4 seconds. Notice the very different impressions from each shot. Dead still. Little bit of motion. You can tell it's a Ferris wheel that's moving. Or a complete blur. In this next series, I used a technique called panning. It's where you use a slow shutter speed such as 1/4 or 1/8 of a second and follow a moving subject. You begin by pre-focusing in manual mode on the spot where the action will be, or you can put your camera in autofocus into servo mode so that your camera will follow the subject. Next, begin to follow your subject as you look through the camera and wait for the right moment, and then fire the shutter and keep following the subject with your camera and body. This will keep your subject relatively sharp while blurring the background. It's a great way to show a subject's motion within the frame. This photo of a bride on a carousel uses the same technique, but I've also thrown in some fill flash here to help freeze the motion. This image of the fish in an aquarium also uses a slow shutter speed and a flash. Here the blur was created by using 1/4 of a second exposure. When using a flash and a shutter slow enough to show subject motion, it is called dragging the shutter. The trick to this image is to set your flash on rear sync. This means your flash will fire at the end of the 1/4 second exposure rather than at the beginning, making your moving subject look as if it's trailing a blur. If your flash is set to front sync, it fires at the beginning of the exposure. This makes your subject look like it's moving backwards. Actually, when I get a new flash, I just set it to rear sync and then never take it off. There really aren't any compelling reasons to use it in the front sync mode. In this shot, the camera was on a tripod and the wind was blowing. This shutter was set to about 2 seconds, but if the wind was stronger, you could go shorter. This technique shows some motion while other parts of the scene remain sharp. This is always an interesting mix visually. These next images show essentially the same thing, a very typical technique when shooting moving water. Here the shutter speed was set to 1/2 of a second, while this was taken at 2 seconds to smooth out the water. Which one suits your taste more? A little motion in the water? Or smoothed out? This makes it seem almost still, so here a longer exposure actually gives you less motion. Feels like there's nothing moving within the frame. Sense of calmness. Now, when you have subjects that are frozen by the exposure, but we know that they're actually moving, it creates a type of visual motion or implied motion. Here we assume the canoe is moving forward. In this case, it looks like it's heading right into the bank. This stops the implied motion cold and makes the image feel quite static. This next shot, I place the canoe further to the left, and now as the boat moves forward, it has a place to go within the frame. This preserves the implied motion. Positive and negative space. Negative space can act like a bridge between two subjects within a frame. It can also distract depending on where it's located. Here the blue sky is what you could consider negative space. Not a lot of action happening in there, just a large, relatively blank area. Now, when a smaller subject, such as this cloud, is surrounded by negative space, the space has the effect of making it seem more powerful or more obvious. Even though it's not a real powerful shape or color in and of itself, there's no question as to where we're supposed to look in this image. We look at the horizontal line of the mountains. That's surrounded by this negative space. And then we look at the cloud, which is of course surrounded by all this negative space. Negative space doesn't always have to be blank, though, like a blue sky. Here I would consider all of this grass to be a negative space. It's all very similar to itself, quite homogeneous. So therefore it becomes one big object. And so the smaller daisies in the bottom gain more importance within the frame. Sandstone Canyon down in Arizona. Same sort of effect. I would consider this to be negative space, even though it's not blank and it does have some texture. And notice how the line points right to here. So this area becomes very powerful. It's the brightest thing, plus all the lines lead to it. And also, it's enhanced by the larger negative space. This shot shows some negative space, quite a bit as a matter of fact, around one simple rock. And in this case, it's almost too simple of a photograph. As compelling as it is, I find this cracked mud very interesting to look at. This is almost not a strong enough subject, because this is so large, it's making this seem very important, and it really just is not all that important. So instead what I did was recomposed and added some of the mountains in the background. Now the negative space heightens this, but we also move back to the mountains as well. So we're kind of creating this triangle of motion within our frame. In this shot, we have some negative space in the black sky, but we also have some negative space over here. This is all the same, so really this whole section of the frame is not too important. And really, this is the object of my frame here. This is what I want to show. So this area is not complementing the frame itself. Recomposing it, removing that black space, or the empty negative space, and now we only have this negative space above. This actually does complement this, however, so it works out fine. Here we have negative space in the form of trees. Now there's just a little stream rolling through these burnt trees, and because the entire scene is made up of sort of a singular type subject, the stream stands out. Now it's also brighter, so that helps as well. But look when you compare that to adding another element and breaking up this negative space. Now you've got another positive here, and this doesn't seem to be as strong any longer. In this shot, we have a very small subject again, and we have a lot of space down here at the bottom. Now in this case, I wouldn't consider it actually negative space, but it is space nevertheless. Now look how your eye follows this line around, and it makes out the fact that this is another lily pad. The shape is almost complete, so we understand that it's round, which lets us envision where this is. Because we can envision it, our eye is more drawn to it. So, by just slightly changing the composition and cutting more of this off, we're not able to finish the circle within our minds. This allows us to focus more on the flower itself. In the next section, upcoming, number 4, we're going to go over subject placement.